Good afternoon, all participants. To welcome all you in a value-added course, Human Right General Perspective. Today we are going to cover about generations of human rights, and we have expert from our university, Integral University, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Dr. Shahwaiz sir. He is going to complete today, or I think today is the last day of this validated course. So we are very excited for that. We are going to conclude this important segment. So please stay connected with us, and please continue watching. Continue this course. So sir is going to complete a generation of human rights, and second, third, and fourth generation of human rights. So we are going to welcome Dr. Shahwaiz sir. Sir, please welcome you and just continue this course.
Hello, dear participants, and first of all, thank you, Dr. Estenata, for welcoming me, and thank you, Professor Zeba Akil, for giving me another chance to complete this last or fifth module, which is based on generation of human rights. And this module fifth, which is based on the module fifth, which is based on the generation of the human rights, is very interesting in many aspects, because in our previous four module 1, module second, and module third, and module fourth, we have covered so many things from the very basic and the meaning of the human rights to the categories of the human rights, and how our human rights extend irrespective of any creed, caste, sex, and in fact gender. And for example, from the first day, we started this value-added course with the very basic meaning, because we already knew that that our participants belong to the different departments. They do not come from the Department of Political Science. They are not specialized in political science or humanities or in particular human rights. So they are just unknown, and they are not really familiar. They are not having any expertise to understand the real meaning, the purpose of and the purpose of the human rights, and the essence of this discipline, and the essence of this course, which is based on the human rights. Therefore, in keeping mind all these realities, all these informations, and in keeping in mind the best interest of our participant, we started this value-added course from the very beginning, from the grassroots level, by which or layman, even the very low, very less knowledgeable participant can easily understand what is the why do we what do we understand by this value-added course, which is based on the human rights general perspective. And why do we need to join this? What is the purpose of joining this value-added course? Now, all the participant, I'm pretty much sure about it, that all participant would have definitely grasped so much information from this ongoing value added course, because we have number of faculties which which have given or which have covered based on the required discussion, required information. And as far as the syllabus is concerned of our value added course, you may find that how our syllabus is designed, that which is very easy to understand if you are really interested to know about the human rights, and what is the purpose of the human rights, why do we need to understand the human rights. And you know what, uh, from the beginning, I emphasize on that there is no need that you must have you must have the link, or you must have belonging to the department of humanities, or you are having the specialization in the humanities, or the any particular discipline of humanities, in order to understand the basic in order to understand the human rights, in order to grasp the knowledge of the human rights. So, irrespective of any discipline, irrespective of any field, or any special field, if you are really interested to know about the human rights, you can join all the lectures, and you can find, you can grasp, you can easily learn the considerable amount of the knowledge which is necessary for the understanding, for developing the understanding about the human rights. And I'm pretty much sure that if you are really conscious about and you are really interesting to join this value added course, so you might have in your mind that it would be a very greater chance to know to learn about the different aspect of the the different faculties. So I hope, I'm pretty much sure that all our lectures, whether the module covered by our faculty members, Dr. Snelata, Dr. Khurshid Alam, Mr. Anil Kumar Singh, and we have also invited many guest lecture which is specialized on the separate module. For example, we yesterday we have the special lecture of Dr. Khaja Danish Hamid, who is expert on history. Earlier, we have also the special lecture given by the Avinash sir. We have also the lecture of Mr. Parvez Alam, who was experts on the human rights in relation to the environment and other aspects. And we had also the special lecture of many dignitaries, uh, many special personalities who have more knowledge than any other else on this concept, which is human rights. So, for example, all our participants, I think if you have joined all the sessions of all the day, you now you have definitely a considerable amount of knowledge about the human rights. Okay, so in case if any participants is still not attend all the lectures about the human rights, so I would request you to generation of the rights, right? So, as far as the so I'm going to share my screen. I hope you are now you now you can see it on your screen as well. As let me share my screen. uh, Yes, I think now you can all see my screen, right? So, what we are going to discuss today? That today we are going to discuss about the generation of rights, right? So, myself, I once again introduce myself. I hope I don't know whether you still remember me or not, but let me introduce to myself once again. Uh, so, my name is Dr. Md Shahwaiz. I am an assistant professor at the Humanities and Social Science Integral University. And I hope you remember that we have also I have also covered module one, which is based on the meaning, nature, and scope of human rights, and also we had a separate lecture on the need and importance, which was also the part of the module one, right? I hope you remember. So let's see this picture. That two hands is like joining each other, and this two hand is somehow unite our world in a way of this struggling of human rights, or developing consciousness about the human rights, or the promotion of the human rights, the serious concern made by many people who already enjoy various rights in their state. They also concern about that the same rights should be enjoyed by the other people on the planet, because they are also human beings. So such kind of the consciousness from one part of the world, people of the one part of the world for the other part of the world, is somehow unite us in a form that this two hand, how this two hand is creating a kind of world or a planet, right? Similarly, we are enjoyed because we don't concern about that someone is Nigerian, someone belong to the African continent, someone belong to the Asian continent, someone belong to Antarctic region, someone belong to any other region on this planet. Irrespective of any regional biasness, irrespective of any other biasness, we are united when we found wherever we found that any stance of the state or any stance of the group of people attacked uh, on the human rights, or they try to violate the human rights, try to withdraw the human rights, which are very essential, because these human rights, as we have already discussed, that these human rights are not given by any authority. In fact, it is the creations of the these rights are the creation of the natural mind. These are rights which we have, which we get with our when we born, with our birth. The creation of a human based on these amenities and entitlements and many privileges, which are in one way or another way somehow integrated into a form of human rights, right? So how these how these rights unite us each other, that how we Asian, people of Asia, people of Africa, Europe, America, all are united whenever it is a concern of the human rights, right? So what what will be the content of today's lecture? I let me brief this content. That for let first uh, we move back slightly, because we need to cover background for the greatest for having the greater understanding about the generation of the human rights. Because if we are not moving back towards the background, because certain things needs to be reconsidered in order to generate, in order to better understand the generation of human rights. Okay, so because today we are finalizing our syllabus, I try my best to finalize this syllabus in this lecture. So for covering this module fifth, the generation of the human rights, we need to go back and try to briefly revise so many things, so we can better understand, we can have better understanding about the generation of the human rights. Then we also briefing of human rights. Again, we are also we will also repeat this human right, because you have I think you have received, and you have listened, you have heard, you have seen about the definition of the human right. You have seen number of times about the UDHR. You have seen number of times of the Bill of Rights. You have seen number of times the French Revolution, American Revolution, and still there is a need to revise that what you have learned, because we are briefing, we are summarizing human rights. And little more I tried my best that to that how I can contribute, and how can I help you for making a better sense, for making sense of this generation of the human right. So for this there is need of what is the idea of human rights. When it comes when did it come in the mind of the people about the human rights, and what is the purpose of creating these human rights, and for what we have created this human rights, or for what purpose we have created this human right, and what was the objective of, before the creation of this human rights. And we need also make sense that whether we have achieve the objective and goals behind the creation of this human rights, or the purpose of the creation of the human rights have fulfilled or not. And again, then we move forward toward the making sense of generations, because it is very easy to say generation of the human rights. Then what is the purpose of the generation of the human right? How do we classify the generations? Because we often listen, we often heard about the term generation. Okay, so a generation often comes in mind that, okay, or ancestors, the life, and the period of the people of our ancestor can be categorized as the older generation, and the life and period of our father and the grandfathers can be characterized as the generation before us. And now we are living in a time or period can be categorized as the present generation. But behind in spite of all these relevant information regarding generation, how this term generation is going to link with the concept of the human rights. What is the purpose to create this to suffix these two words, generation and human rights, with each other, right? So therefore then we could find that how that first generation of human rights is different from the second generation of the human right, and how the second generation of human right is different from the third generation of human right, and how fourth generation of the human right is different from the rest of the three or former generations of the human rights, right? And then we move towards the conclusion, and we will conclude this module with the conclusion. Okay, let's move with a little bit background, right? So what we have learned, in the first module, that the meaning and nature and scope of human rights. What is the meaning? What is the meaning of the human rights? That human rights are essential conditions. Human rights are those conditions which are essential for the survival of the humanity. You cannot say that these things are inalienable. These certain rights are indivisible. These certain rights are universal in nature. You cannot discriminate whether these rights are essential for the American people only. These rights is equally important for non-American people, for African people, for Asian people, for European people. Because this is something, there is only one thing which is humanity that makes equal to all people, and on the basis of the humanity these rights are essential entitlement, essential privilege, essential condition, essential arrangement for the survival of the humanity, for the development of the for the humanity, for the for making realization of the humans on this planet. These certain rights are the essential condition for realizing it, right? And again, obviously, need and importance. Why do we need an importance? we have we had many shocking news at that time. We have many shocking facts on that that lashed out on your screen, and obviously some of them uh, would definitely raise your eyebrows, that oh my god, such kind of the human rights violation could have been taken place on our planet, could have been taken place even in now in the 21st century. How can we imagine that still more than 800 people are still waiting for for the food to eat? They are forced to they are forced to having they are forced to live on the starvation. So so until each and every human on this planet are able or enumerate with these certain rights or purpose or objective or need or importance can never be fulfilled, right? And in the second, we will have the evolution and genesis of the human rights, that where it comes from, where the concept of the human rights comes from. And we have for covering this module second, we had lectures of Dr. Snehata. She beautifully explained so many important things in this regard. And we had also the special lectures of MD Dr. MD Rahat Hassan, who tracing these human rights from the period of the Greek, and then how the concept of human right developed in the medieval period, and how this concept of the human rights got maturity in the period of the enlightenment. How many prominent thinkers, how writings of the many prominent thinkers of the modern period contributed in the conceptualization of these human rights, right? And similarly, in the module third, we have also so many we had a chance to learn so many things, that how what kind of human rights are. For example, you had a chance to learn about that the minority rights are also considered as the human rights. Women's rights are also considered as the human rights. Disability right, people who are disabled, their rights are also considered as the human rights. Those who are unable to enjoy certain rights, so it is the responsibility to the society and the state that to make them avail all the required condition by which he or she or disabled people may not consider himself that they are not enjoying the human rights. They are not fulfilling the required condition of the humanities, right? And for covering this fourth third module, we had lectures of Mr. Anil Kumar Singh, and who deliver wide information regarding the module third, right? He 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 had very powerful words on exploring, on unfolding the various kind of rights that also considered as the part of human rights, right? Similarly, in the fourth module, we had also lectures of the Dr. Khurshid Alam, who who conceptualized, who who gave you a very important information regarding the human rights in the context of the Indian constitutions, in the context of your country, in the context of the machinery of the Indian constitution or Indian administration, that facilitate one way or other way in order to the promotion of the human rights, in order to facilitate people to enjoy these human rights, which are considered, which are backed by the United Nations, right? So now we have covered a brief background of our previous fourth model, and now it's time to cover this fifth model. Okay, so for this model, let's have that now you have considered that what is the human rights. Okay, if somebody asked you that what is the human right, I'm pretty much sure that you will have so many things to explain regarding the human right, because this value-added course has given you so many information, so many important information, essential information, for by which you cannot avoid, you cannot feel yourself helpless to in order to answer this the question about the what is human right, because you can proudly say that I have attended a value-added course on human rights, so I have pretty much knowledge what is human right, and what are human rights, where it comes from, what are the categories of the human rights, what are the Indian perspective of human rights, how human rights are enjoyed by the Indian people under the protection of the Indian Constitution, right? So human rights has become wide concept. It is not a concept of only in the West, and in fact, this concept has become a separate ideology. So the strength of this concept that a human right is still become as a separate ideology. So somebody, get it, what is your ideology? Somebody says I am liberal, I am Marxist, and so on, so on, so on. So similarly, in the context of this, so somebody said I am humanist, I am cosmopolitan, and obviously, if someone claim himself or herself as a cosmopolitan, uh, he must he must have consciousness. He must have the affirmative actions or uh, affirmative consciousness regarding the human rights as a separate ideology. He or she claiming himself or herself as a cosmopolitan must have ideology which somehow supported the promotions and the promotion of the human rights. So, on the other hand, it has also the right. Human rights are also constituted as a right, as a constituted as a religion of bunch of values. So it has those who are believing in a human right, that who treat people on the basis of the humanity, irrespective of the, any religion, irrespective of any creed and caste, irrespective of any differences. These kind of the people have separate religion. They claim themselves that we have a religion of human. So if you are really consider about the human rights, that you can also claim that I have a religion, I follow those religious values which support the human rights, right? So human rights human rights, what are human rights? Obviously human rights are as ethical. So those who are claiming himself or herself as a supporter of the human rights cannot be unethical, cannot be characterized as a immoral. That this is your ethical attribute, this is your moral attribute to support human rights. And in fact, the human right has become a yardstick or a measurement to judge the governance of any state. And because we are living in a state, we are living in a time period, we are living in a world where every country interconnected, the drastic transformation of the information and the massive development in the course of the communication technologies, we have now get the information of every corner of this world. We are not deprived of the information. So on the basis of the given information by our communications agencies, particularly media, so on the basis of the given information, we can characterize that these states are not supporting the human right, because they are not treating their citizens on the basis of humanity. For example, recently you must aware about the war which is going on between the Ukraine and Russia, and the actions and the atrocities made by the Russia led people to judge Russia, that Russia is not caring about the humanities, because the atrocities, the attacks, the army personals of the Russia, or to some extent the army personnel, the attacks and the atrocities made by these Ukrainian forces, do not care about their civilians, who who do not have any engagement or in ongoing war, because civilians never declared war. So, on the basis of the treatment, on the basis of such kind of the violence, on the basis of the provisions, on the basis of the lawmaking and the decision making power in any political machinery of the country, we can judge that a country or a state, that whether this country is very conscious about the human rights. So, a broad consensus has emerged in the 28th century. Okay, 20वीं सदी में एक ब्रॉड कॉन्सेंसस बन चुका है इसका। भले से ह्यूमन राइट्स को हम पढ़ रहे हैं कि दैट ह्यूमन राइट्स अ पार्ट that took place in the ancient history, right? We have now knowledge that many lectures which is based on Genesis and the evolution of the human rights can elaborate that how our human rights are rooted in the history of the world, that how many rulers, many kings, particularly the king of Cyprus, released the slave uh, slave and signified that freedom of the slave as a beginning of the human rights, right? So, in this 20th century, a rhetoric that framed judgment of nation against an international moral code prescribing certain benefits and treatment for all humans simply because they are human. The world is pretty much different from the earlier world, right? The world of pre world wars was different, and the world is quite different after world wars, because the treatment of the human, and obviously people are enjoying more rights in comparison to their earlier generations, the people of the earlier period, right? So with many nations, and in this context the United Nations played very important role in order to realizing the state, that state has also morality, state has also prescribing norms and values. So on the basis of these prescribed norms and values, state needs to make such kind of the arrangement, whether in the constitution or any other means, by which your citizens can enjoy these rights. If you are not protecting their right, this means you are not fulfilling the purpose of the democracy. If you are not fulfilling the purpose of the cosmopolitan ideology, you are not fulfilling the purpose of perpetuate peace, ultimate peace. If you are succeed in providing the human rights extensively, then it will consider as the peace of permanent, the permanence peace. That peace cannot be violated by any kind of the violence. This is kind of this kind of the statement made by the cosmopolitan, made by the people who are conscious about the human rights. So, with many nations, political debates rage over the denial or the abuse of the human rights, right? Even in prosperous democratic countries like Canada, much more public discourse and praise in the rhetoric of the rights, right? In many countries in the West, many countries in the Europe, still this human rights concept is debated, that how whether our countries are really extending the support of people in order to enjoy their fundamental rights, their human rights, right? So human rights are known as the basic inalienable right, as I mentioned earlier, that it is inalienable. Inalienable means nobody can snatch it to you, nobody can withdraw it from you, because somebody जब किसी ने ये राइट्स दिए ही नहीं है आपको, तो किसी को हक भी नहीं है। ये राइट्स आपको कहाँ से मिले हैं? नेचुरली मिले हैं आपको। सो ये these rights cannot be snatched, this right cannot be suspended by any authority, because any authority has no right to snatch, to withdraw these human rights from you. And these rights belong to each and every person without any discrimination, as I mentioned earlier. These rights rest on the values of dignity, fairness, respect, freedom, and autonomy of the human person. In fact, in keeping mind gravity of this human right, UNICEF defines human rights as a standard that recognizes and protects the dignity of all human beings. Okay, and the preamble of the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights UDHR 1948 का preamble ये कहता है that whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. I repeat once again, whereas the recognition of the inherent dignity and of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. That means you cannot establish the required condition of the freedom. You cannot extend the freedom. You cannot establish justice. You cannot make a essential ultimate peace in the world without the consideration, without the implementation of the inherent dignity of all members of the human family, right? So simply, what the idea of human right? What do you understand by the idea of human right? Let me begin with the right. What is rights? हक क्या है आपका? What is the hak? What is the right? So rights are those conditions which are basic in nature. Basic in nature, without which you cannot survive. You cannot call yourself as a human. So rights, basic need to which we are entitled or allowed. And in the context how human rights is different, that okay, certain rights cannot be called as a human rights. For example, right to have good home, right to have live in apartment. अगर आपको एक अच्छे घर में रहना है, एक अच्छा घर होना जरूरी है कि भाई एयर कंडीशन होना बहुत जरूरी है. These rights cannot be called as a human right. They can be called as a right that if you are capable enough, if you are having money, you can buy air condition, you can make your house beautiful. That cannot be that can your right. Nobody can prevent you from having these luxuries or comfort, and these are also your right to increase your living standard. But these conditions cannot be equivalent to the human rights. Human rights slightly different. Human rights are inalienable fundamental rights to which a person is inherently entitled for the mere fact of it. For example, if we say that humans can also live human can also live in other kind of the shelter, like okay, rain basera आपने देखा होगा. People are live on roads. They are alive still. They are still alive, but it doesn't mean they don't have right to shelter. Their right to shelter is an essential aspect. Is their essential part of the human rights. Because without these right to shelter, they cannot claim that they are enjoying human rights. Similarly, right to food. Similarly, right to having cloth. Similarly, some people do not have the water to drink. Some people do not have the clean water to drink. Some people, a number of people do not have a healthy food to eat. And national इंडिया में एक बहुत बड़ा सर्वे होता है, हर साल होता है, हर 10 साल को होता है. नेशनल हेल्थ एंड फैमिली सर्वे. उसके अकॉर्डिंग आप देखेंगे उसमें 2015 का एक सर्वे है, उसमें कहा जा रहा है कि that women are still marginalized in order to get the sufficient amount of the nutrition in comparison to the men. So a required number of the calories taken by the pupil are necessary as a part of human right. For example, if you are living in the rural area, there is a parameter of 2,400 calories in a day, And if you are living in a urban area, that there is also a need of 2100 calories in a day. If you are having below these if you are having the food which have calories, which you are if you are consuming the calories below 2100 in urban and 2400 in rural, it means that you are not fulfilling your required nutrition for a day, right? So we need to make concern about that, how rights are different from the condition of the human rights, right? So now I hope that you have differentiate now between the simple rights and what is the difference between the human rights, and how human rights is different from the simply human rights. Okay, clear and universal awareness of what we are known as a human rights, the modern trend, which arose and became consolidated basically after the 18th century and following the American and French Revolution. So, in the context of the idea of human rights, uh, many moments in our history are of paramount importance. For example, American Revolution, French Revolution. French revolutions play a pivotal role in trading the path of the human rights. And I will elaborate the importance of the French Revolution when we move towards the generation of the human rights. Okay. Similarly, the Enlightenment period in the Europe, you must aware about that, how 13th century onward, how our Enlightenment period started in the European continent, how this Enlightenment period talks about the rationalization of the authority, how this enlightenment period talks about the separation of the religion and the morality, separation of the religion and the state. They are also, the enlightenment period also concern about that we need to make a such kind of the governance, such kind of the policy, such kind of the society which are more individual oriented. Okay, so the prioritization of the individual of the state is also one of the hallmark of the Enlightenment period in Europe, right? So when we refer to the human right, we have to take into consideration the fundamental ideas which underlie this phenomena, right? Sorry, phenomenon. So the first idea is the inherent human dignity, whereby two certain so okay, two conditions required for considering the what is human rights and what is simple rights. Okay, the first idea, that inherent human dignity, whereby human rights seek to defend safe dignity. So the dignity is important. Human dignity lies in many conditions. For example, as I earlier mentioned, that the right to food, right to have clothes, right to have shelter, right to have drink water. Okay, water to drink, food to eat. These kind of the condition that can be that is a part of the human dignity. Okay, and some people are forced to compromise with these conditions, with these commodities, whether food, water, clothes. That means that they are not their dignity is not fulfilling, their dignity is being threatened. And the second idea refers to the setting limits on power, whereby human rights are one of the traditional limits on the omnipresent power of the states. What does it mean? That before the rationalization, before the big growing consciousness about the human right, it was considered that the state was solely responsible to decide the destiny of the individuals. It is the state who decide who determines what is the required condition for fulfilling this human dignity. No, here states have important role to play for facilitating, for supporting the life of the people on the in the state, but state should not have the omnipresent power. So this parameter of this power needs to be considered before before the understanding of the human rights, that how it is required to make certain limits, certain amounts of restraint, certain amount of preventions on the omnipresent, on the over powerful, or the absolute nature of the absolute power of the state. Because the greater the power of the state, the greater the chance of the power of abuse. And power of, whenever the case of the power abuse is concerned, there was a case of human rights violations. So how this overpower and the nature of the power of the absolute of power, the nature of the absolute power of the state or ruler or any other authority in the world. So this kind of authority can be a threat uh, uh, for the continuance of the human rights. So human rights, why are human rights important? Let's do once again. Though we had already a separate lecture on this, that we need human rights, but again let's brief it. Okay. So why do we need human rights? Because they protect us. They protect us from any despotic rule, from any power abuse, from any such kind of the totalitarian or authoritarian state that impact our human dignity. And the human rights allow us to build societies that are safe on the basis of the human rights, on the basis of the norms and values of the humans. We can make certain kind of the societies that are characterized as safe, prosperous, and desirable to live, right? So human rights gave us the power to speak up, and the right to freedom of expression, right to freedom of speech and expression is another is another important right which are considered and which are essential for the human rights. So if we do not allow to speak, how can we share our feeling? How can we share that certain things are still not enjoyed by me? It means that I am not enjoying certain kind of the right which you are claiming for others. So human rights give us the power to speak up and share our opinions with everyone else, especially those in power. For example, if people do not have right to speak, how rest of the people or how the people of the other part of the world could come to know that so your rights are violating. So this is the power of speak. This is the right to freedom of expression that makes enable to those people that somewhere in the world the human rights are being violated. So they also protect us from harm or undue burden. For example, the child labor, right? The engagement of the women in the hard labor work, in such kind of the labor which are not admissible for women at least, right? So they gave us the power to participate, whether through protest or association of voting, shaping the world we live in. So how the human rights protect us from that? Obviously, uh, no organizations can force to work you for a particular amount of hours. For example, it was a norm. It is still a norm in the United States of America that you cannot force someone to work more than 8 hours in a day. If you want to have work from him or her more than 8 hours, you will have to separately charge him or her. Okay. And also there is also the provisions of the basic wage. For example, irrespective of any education, whether he or she is 10th pass, having the general education degree, GED कहते हैं वहाँ पर. So they protect us from डेट अगर आप 10th भी किए हुए हैं, अगर आप सिर्फ जीईडी का डिप्लोमा है आपके पास, उसके बिहाफ पर भी आपको कोई भी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन, कोई भी कंपनी, कोई भी रेस्टोरेंट, कोई भी ऐसी कॉमर्शियल साइट आपको 12 आवर्स पर $12 पर आवर्स के हिसाब से कम नहीं दे सकती. If any organization engage in giving you a less wages on the required, on the norms of wages, that organization, that company, that enterprise can face punishable instances, okay, punishable consequences. So human rights, secondly, human rights also give us individual freedom to do the things we want. Earlier it was not there. On the basis of the security, on the basis of the norms, on the basis of the strategy, on the basis of the amenities of the state, the freedom of the people compromised, threatened, and suspended many times in our history. So this is the human rights that enable you the individual freedom, the enjoyment of the individual freedom. फॉर एग्जाम्पल इन अगर इंडिया के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में अगर हम देखें, दैट इंडियन कॉन्टेक्स्ट, द 42nd अमेंडमेंट ऑफ द इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन सेज that you cannot suspend the certain basic rights even in the situation of the emergency. You cannot suspend the right to life, which is enshrined under Article 21. So to practice the religion of choosing to be a part of the groups we want to associate with, the freedom to receive an education and taken together, all of these things mean that human rights allow us to hold government to account. If any act of government, any policy of the government, any law of the government may subject to the violation of your human rights, you can make your government accountable. You can force your government, you can protest against those instances, and you can realize the government that your actions are not suitable to the fulfillment of our human rights. So not just in elections, but when a government commits atrocities against its own or foreign people, human rights laws provide the legal basis to hold them accountable. Okay, so we do not need to wait 5 years for next elections to make government accountable. You have right. You are living in a democracy. You have right to speak upon it. Okay, so you can elaborate about the style of the governance, the manner in which the government works. Okay, so this is the beauty of the democratic governance. So this is another kind of the picture in front of your screen, that so on the screen what you are seeing, you are seeing that how irrespective how the multiple kind of the people are enjoying and celebrate the victory of human rights. And you can see that how different people and different culture, different religion, different caste, different creeds are united just because they are constitute one single characteristic, which is humanity. So how these human rights play important role in order to intertwine ourselves from each other, irrespective of any continent, irrespective of any country, irrespective of any state, irrespective of any society. And this is the Vienna Declaration in 1993, that all rights are universal, indivisible, and interdependent and interrelated. So the another kind of the importance of the human right, that human rights are universal in nature. You cannot differentiate that on that certain rights are all can only entertain or only enjoyed by the Americans. So these rights cannot be enjoyed by the African Asian people. No, these are universal in nature. Similarly, indivisible. You cannot divide these rights. You cannot break these rights. You cannot make partiality in providing these rights. And on the similarly, these rights are also interdependent and interrelated. For example, the in relation that for example the right to liberty and right to equality. If you are having the right to liberty, then you are not equal from each other. How can you exercise? How can you enjoy the equal amount of the liberty? That certain people, on the basis of their political linkages, economic power, social status, they are enjoying more freedom than you. And this means if you are differentiating, if you are partial in providing the human rights, it means they are not human rights, they are contested conditions. So contested condition can be rights but not human rights. Human rights are interdependent. Okay. So if we make contextualize the generation of the human rights. So a key text for us today is the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights. Many times you have listened this word adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1914. But the enumeration of the human right was not simply the frozen by proclamation in 1948. Since that the time, dozens of treaties. The number of treaties have been made in this regard. For example, in 1984, at the height of this flurry of writing up rights, Philip Alston suggested that new international human rights be subject like wine to a quality control by the United UN General Assembly. The relevant UN resolution adopted in 1986 suggested that international human rights instruments should. So the international human rights, instrumental in nature. In what sense? Be consistent with the existing body of the international human rights law. Be a fundamental in character. Be sufficiently precise to give rise to identifiable and practicable rights and obligations. Provide these rights where appropriate, where realistic, where effective implement. So effective implementation are being required. So for the effective implementation, active and vibrant machinery are required, including reporting system. Right? Attract broad international support. International support is also important for extending these rights in all member states. So making sense of generations. According to Carl Wellman, another human rights activist, Carl Wellman, who says that generations succeed one another. Not only in that a member of one generation are born before those of the next generation, but also in that parents tend to die before their generation. Okay, and generation are also being used as a metaphor. आपने अक्सर सुना होगा that our father generation is different from our generation, or generation of our father was not enjoying many rights which we are enjoying today, are not enjoying many conditions which we are enjoying today. For example, the condition, the right, the facility of the internet, the facility of the communications, the mobile facility, right? So how these generations differ from each other, not only in the living conditions, but also different on the basis of the human rights enjoyment, human rights conditions, human rights uh, availability of the human rights. Okay, so generation can be used as a word or phrase used to describe somebody something else in a way that is different from its normal use, in order to show that the two things have the same qualities and to make the description more powerful. So on your screen there is a picture of Karel Vasek. He is a Czech jurist, Czechoslovakia. Now it has separated. Czech अलग हो चुका है and Slovakia अलग है in 1995. So he was at that time Czechoslovakia was a united. At that time he was Czech jurist. Jurists are those who work on the concept of law. So he designed three generation of rights. So his contribution is really important for understanding the generation of human rights. So generation of the human rights in the late 1970s, when Karel Vasek offered his concept of the three generation of rights, it was inclusive enough to embrace the whole spectrum of existing human rights. Though it was though there was the consciousness of the human right. Obviously, 1948 symbolizes the the uh, symbolizes that UDHR has have already been given the certain rights for the humanity in the world. But in the late 1970s, the Karel Vasek offered another kind of the concept in the context of classification of the rights on the basis of the generations. So, nevertheless, it has been over 4 decades since Vasek's generations entered the human rights debate. So, it has been debated since 1970. And being aware of the new global environment after the Cold War, the new challenges, tides of democratization, and illiberal resurgence, new pressing problems like terrorism and the migrations that continue to profoundly influence the national and international priorities. And the evolving nature of the human rights discourse, we wonder whether Vasek's generation of human rights are still valid. Because, in fact, 50 years before Karel Vasek created or made such kind of the argument in the context of the human rights, and the argument made by the Karel Vasek is still valid. For example, he talked about the new global environment. He talked about the democratizations. Who talked about the promotion of the liberal values. He talked about it that terrorism should be avoided, terrorism should be collapsed, terrorism should be controlled and managed, because terrorism is the one of the major threat on the human rights, and migration that continues to profoundly influence the national and international priorities. And we have seen that how civil wars in the Middle East and many countries force people to migrate from their native place to different places, different unknown places, where they did not even found the shelter, food, and require conditions that signify the human dignity. Okay. So, how Karel Vasek defined generation of the human rights? That first generation of the human rights characterized as civil and political rights. Secondly, second generation of the rights, social, economic, and cultural rights. And third generation rights are solidarity rights. Okay, we further elaborate these rights, but there is a picture in front of you that classify in that is the classification of the generation of the human rights made by the Karel Vasek. Yes, what is this in front of you? You are very familiar about it. Please make some comments on this. What is this? I hope you can recognize this language. And this is French language. What is this? This is the motto of the French revolutions. Unite, indivisible, republic, liberty, equality, जिसको एगेलाइट कहते हैं, एंड फ्रेटर्निटी, जिसको फ्रेटरनाइट कहते हैं, and all are mode, or this is all motto of French revolutions. So French revolutions I think the most important, for me at least, the most important role played by the French revolutions for unfolding the essentiality and the necessity of the human rights, for changing the entire discourse towards the relation between the individual and state. So, what is the importance of the French Revolution? That three generations of the human rights correspond respectively to the three ideals French revolutions, which I just mentioned. These three values are the hallmark of the French Revolution. Motto of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity. You know what? Let me say one thing to you, that you might have thinking, you might have thought, you might have question that whatever the rights we are enjoying in our times, right? These rights are not created all of sudden. These are rights which are created, which you are having in present time, which you are enjoying. These rights are a consequence of the prolonged process, that has been going on from the centuries. Similarly, the 18th century, and particularly the last 2 decades of the 18th century, in the French Revolution, the French Revolution took place, and the French Revolutions remarks a very important point in the context of the fundamental rights and the individual, in the prioritization of the individual over the state, over the power of the state, and how the nature of the state changed from the French revolutions, and how, you know what, how many people have died in French Revolution? More than 17,000 people were died, just because that they are conscious about certain important right. They are conscious about that state should be treated their citizens on the basis of the equality, on the basis of the liberty, on the basis of the fraternity. These mottos were important. These three motto were in mind of the French people, who were struggling for the rights of the people of future generations. So history is very important, and such kind of the revolutions are also important. That these revolutions brought many drastic change in our society. These revolutions played a very important role to change the nature not only of our state but also of our society. So so what is liberty? What does it mean? The liberty corresponds to the first generation right, because they protect fundamental freedoms such as freedom of expression and freedom of having religion, freedom of faith. Similarly, equality corresponds to the second generation rights, because they are aimed at the amelioration of the social and economic inequalities. Okay, as third is another kind of the importance is fraternity as having importance, because it underpins third generation rights. In the 18th century created such kind of the awareness for the civil and the political rights among the people. The rights, particularly civil and political, particularly the right to freedom of speech and expression, right to vote, right to contest elections, right to have a freedom of religion, right from discriminations, and so on and so on. Earlier, people were not enjoying the right to freedom of speech and expression. People were not having right to vote equally. People who were having the lots of money, belong to the aristocrat family and wealthier family, were only having the right to vote. So such kind of the discrimination took place in the history in the context of the fundamental rights and the human rights. So such kind of the revolutions and historical events played very important role in order to extend, in order to correct certain mistakes of the history, and by which we are really having all those rights which are essential irrespective of any differences. Similarly, the English Revolution of the 1688, जिसको ग्लोरियस रेवोल्यूशन भी कहा जाता है, which recognized the supremacy of the parliament, and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789, and the American Bill of the Rights of 1791 are some noteworthy examples that shaped the first generation of the human rights. If these revolution, these historical events would not have taken place, what is the importance of the freedom and choice? That how this first generation rights changed dramatically the concept of the state, the condition in which individuals were prioritized in comparison to the state. So individuals are of more important than state. States cannot be considered as the more powerful than state. It is the individual who are considered individuals are considered more powerful than state, right? And in this context, many important writings, particularly the social contract theorists John Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau, the writings of these three thinkers, massive, greatly important for the change, for changing the nature of the authority, for changing the nature of the power. Because before these writings, before the 18th century, it was considered, it was common sense to having the more power for a state. Before states were incarcerated a kind of religious entity. The state was incarcerated into a faith, into a into a institutions which which fall down on the earth by the force of the god. So it is important to having, or to possess the more power for a state, for regulating the behavior of the individual, for providing the security to the individual. But the writing of these contractualists change this discourse. Look, and these contractualists, these thinkers emphasize that it is the responsibility of the individuals It is the right of the people to make state what kind of a state they want, what kind of the governance they want, how individuals want that the state should exercise its power in such a way by which we individual can enjoy more rights than create more instance of obligation towards the state. So list of the first generation of the human rights are your on screen. That what is the first generation of the human rights? Right to life. Right to life is very important. For example, it is very easy to say okay right to life तो important है ही, सब लोग जीते तो हैं ही, भले से कम जिए ज़्यादा जिए, एक टाइम खाना खा के जिए या दो टाइम खाना खा के जिए, but right to life is another can have another sense. What kind of sense? Because if we go back to the history, that history is full of many armed conflicts, many wars, many interstate wars. So in these armed conflict and interstate war, the lives of many civilians, a number of civilians were not considered important. It was important for the state to make its victory instead of the lives of the people, instead of the humanities, or instead of the humanity of the people. So how how ego of the state, how state's enmity towards the other state, how the lust for the power of the state crushed down the right to life. And you know what? If we adding the casualty, total number of the casualty of both the world wars, it is something more than 12 millions of people have lost their lives in two world wars. 12 billions. Freedom, another kind of right. First generation, freedom from torture. Torture was very common in our earlier period. Anyone who somehow caught by the forces for the state or the enemy state were brutally tortured, was subject to torture, were brutally treated in their prisoner cells. So first generation rights are also extend that there should be a freedom from torture. If you catch someone as a war prisoners, as a political prisoner, that these prisoners are also entitled to have maintained their dignity. You cannot treat these prisoners without consideration of their nature of humanity. Similarly, freedom from slavery. Slavery was very common in earlier period. People were having slaves. Their creed, the entire creed of slave, uh, पहले उनके फादर के फादर स्लेव थे, उनके फादर के फादर, फिर बेटा, फिर उसके आने वाले वक्त में. So these kind of the slavery were greatly entertained. There was nothing wrong to having slave at that time. So first generation of the human rights also comprise that freedom from slavery, because slavery is a inhuman act. You do not have right to rule over the other without the consent of others. And slavery is something in which people who are slave uh, do not exercise their human rights, because they are engaging in a kind of activities which are not consented by him or her. Freedom, another kind of the right, freedom from arbitrary arrest, detentions. Many instances of the detention and arrest on the basis of the suspicions, on the basis of the state power, on the basis of the on the basis of the security, on the basis of the revenge. So just because that you state or any authority have suspicion on you, they can arrest you, they can detain you, but they cannot treat you without the consideration of human rights. So such kind of the arbitrary arrest, detentions should not allowed because they are violating the human rights. राइट टू ह्यूमन ट्रीटमेंट एंड डिटेंशन, ऑब्वियसली डिटेंशन सेंटर्स में आपने देखा हो किस तरीके ट्रीटमेंट करते हैं, जानवरों की तरह लोगों को रखते हैं. पीपल आर बीइंग ट्रीटेड लाइक एनिमल्स. इन ह्यूमन ट्रीटमेंट वर गिवन many prisoners even in the jail of the many countries in the west. So such kind of the demands were made at the time of the first generation rights, that certain kind of the conditions should be treated even for the people who are detained. Freedom of movement and residence. Obviously, people should allowed to move from one place to another because this is their the movement, the freedom of movement and residence is their human rights. Prohibition of expulsion of aliens. Prohibition of the expulsion of aliens. For example, people of different state considered as the aliens, enemy. So such kind of a treatment should not be entertained because irrespective of the state, all we are human. So we should not treat it like aliens. Freedom of thought, conscience, and religious belief. It is also the human right, that freedom of thought. I should have freedom of thought. I can thought freely. I can think freely. I can have thought irrespective of any force. We should not force not to think, not to having thought in my mind. This would be my right to decide what religion I have to follow. I choose to decide what kind of religion. This would be my right. Freedom of expression and right to privacy. Right to privacy is also also included in the first generation right. Okay, though right to privacy has also been debated in our present time because of many instances, because of the penetrations of the uh, penetration and explosion of the communications and internet and technological devices that are impacting and attacking on the right to privacy. More rights in the context of the first generation rights: non-imprisonment for death. For example, earlier people who took debt, कर्जे के बिना पे लोगों को क्या किया जाता था, बंदी बना लिया जाता था, कैप्टिव कर लिया जाता. कैप्टिविटी वाज कॉमन ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ द डेथ, कर्जे के बिना पर. ये चीज़ फर्स्ट जनरेशन राइट में खत्म करने की डिमांड की गई. फर्स्ट जनरेशन राइट में जिन लोगों को दिया गया. फेयर ट्रायल सब डिवाइडेड इनटू 16 इनोमिनेटेड राइट्स. फेयर ट्रायल होना चाहिए, दैट जब तक किसी का जुर्म साबित ना हो जाए. ओके, सो एवरीवन शुड हैव फेयर ट्रायल. हो सकता है द पर्सन whom you detain, whom you arbitrarily arrest, may not have any mistake, may not have committed any crime. So he or she should be right to have a fair trial by which he or she can prove his or her innocence. Right to personhood under the law. Obviously personhood is important. Under the law cannot be discriminative in nature. Right to equality is important. Equality before law is important. Law is equal for all, whether poor or rich, whether white or black, whether man or woman, whether child. Law is equal for all. Freedom of assembly, freedom of association, right to marry and found a family is also the first generation of rights. You know what? Many women did not have right to marry, did not have choose whom they want to marry. They did not have right to choose a family to live. So it was a part of the first generation of right that everyone should have right to marry and should have right to found a family, make a family, make associations, can be a part of any assembly. They can assemble in a place to celebrate the birthdays, any other movements, rights of children, rights to practice religion, prohibition of war propaganda and hate speeches, constituting incitements, right to hold offices, right to vote in free elections, right to be elected to office, equal access to public services. And you know what? The central ideas of the first generation right was personal liberty. Because these personal liberties were many times compromised, threatened, violated because it was a state who were given more priority than individuals, and every time individual liberty were compromised, individual liberty was being were being threatened in the context of the state security, state immunities. So protecting the individual against the violation of the state was the foremost reason, was the most important reason behind the creation of this first generation of human rights. Second generation of the human rights, social, cultural, and economic. The second generation of human rights are the social, economic, and the cultural rights, such as the right to work, right to choose your occupation, right to education. Education was not for all in earlier times. Right to have a cultural participation. Unlike the civil and political rights, which we have just discussed in the first generation right, second generation's rights were shaped by a different context in which two major factors were greatly responsible. What are those factors? Those factors are the advent of industrializations, industrial revolution were very important, and the growth of capitalism was very important. These two instances, these two are major factors for shaping and creating the second generation of rights. Because these two factors created a conditions that greatly responsible for the massive level of inequalities in our societies. And as rightly pointed out by our Karl Marx and later Marxist, they said that so vividly rapid industrialization creates not only the class stratification but also consolidate the emerging income inequalities. Like first generation right, second generation right have also its own peculiarities and importance, right? So with the growing inequalities due to the rise of the industrialization and the capitalism, these rights demanded for the positive role of the state. Point to be noted here that in the first generation of rights, we demanded that least role should be played by the state by which we can enjoy maximum rights. But now in the context of the second generation right, we demand a positive role of the state. The role of the state is important for the protection and the promotion of these socio-economic rights because certain amount of the groups or certain amount of the group of people are having more right than others than rest of the people, and these kind of the people, just because of their greed, just because of their notorious profit orientations, the massive level of the inequalities have been created. And in fact, according to the introduction part of the declaration of the United Nations Universal Declaration of the Human Rights, it was there that lack of recognition through human rights and despising it has led to savage actions which cause the human soul to rebel, and the appearance of a world where human has the freedom of speech and fearless to poverty has been declared as the highest ideal of the human. Another in the continuance of the importance of the second generation right, Stephen Marx, another important writer and human rights activist, who is professor at the Harvard University, identified seven principles in the context of the second generation right, which are as following. For example, he said that progressive realization of the ESCR means economic, social, and cultural rights. Progressive realization of these rights, a state must take meaningful measures meaningful measures towards full realization of these rights. It means that without the role played by the state, the enjoyment of these certain economic, social, cultural rights are not cannot fulfilled. Immediate implementation of the CPR. CPR means civil and political rights. So immediate implementation of the CPR is also required. States have duties to respect and ensure its respect for these rights. So these CPR, civil and political rights, are prerequisite condition for the ESCR. We cannot enjoy economic, social, and cultural rights without the implementation of the civil and political rights. So non-discriminatory approach, non-discriminatory motive is required by the state in order to apply, in order to implement all these rights. An effective remedy for the violation of the CPR. So if CPR, cultural political rights, are being violated, then it is the responsibility of the state to correct all those mistakes, and to punish all those violators of these civil and political rights. Equality of rights between men and women is also important in the context of the second generation right, because it was considered that the first generation right were greatly focused on the men only, because whether the French Revolution, whether the revolution of the American Revolution, it was there only that men are born equal, therefore they should have a certain amount of the conditions. For example, the creation of the rights of man and citizen, where is the women? So many feminists raised this point that how we synonymously use the rights of man in the context of the human rights. So there is also the equal recognitions of the both the genders in the context of the human rights. This is also the category of second generation right. The international bill also specifies that human rights may be subject to the limitations and the derogations. The rights in the covenants may not be used as a pretext for lowering an existing standard if there is a higher one under national law. These are the second generation of rights. Right to gain a living by work, free to choose it and accept it. Yani, it means that you should have right to gain a living by work freely. You can choose your occupation, you can choose your work field, you can choose your workplace. Nobody can stop you to work from whatever in a particular company or in a particular workplace. And similarly, the enterprises, the companies are also advised to accept all and respect the right of the right to their choose right to choose their occupation. Okay. And secondly, right to just and favorable work conditions. And there is another kind of the consciousness was developed in the second generation of right, because people were not treated equally at the workplace. So it was there, it was keeping mind in the creation, those who were there for the creation of the second generation right, that the right to just and favorable place working conditions are required for keeping mind and for fulfilling the human rights. So it is the human rights to provide the favorable and just condition by which they can work freely, they can work equally, they can enjoy their work. Right to form and join trade unions. Obviously, earlier people were not allowed to join any trade unions, to form unions, because if you were creating if you are forming such kind of the unions, it means that you are not following the state. You do not believe in a state. So these kind of the creation of the unions, these kind of the participation in this such kind of the unions were not allowed. These were also considered the crime. So the people had this right to form and join trade unions in the second generation. Right to strike. If your demands, if your labor, if labor demands something from the companies, from the manager, from the boss, and that were and those are essential demands, and if they are not fulfilled, you have right to strike. For example, अगर पेट्रोल के प्राइस बढ़ जाते हैं तो जो ऑटो ड्राइवर्स होते हैं वो किस तरीके से Right to housing, roti kapda makan. This is the adequate standard of living. This is the second generation of the human right. Right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. It was also the concern for such kind of the people that it should be the right of the people to attain the standard of physical and mental health. If somebody was not mentally normal or physically normal, he or she should have right to get this normalcy to restore this normalcy. Right to education toward the fulfillment and the development of the human personality is also the second generation of right, because earlier people, all people were not having the right to education. Only wealthy and aristocrat families were engaging in the right to education to get the education. People were not equally had not equally the access of education. So second generation rights promote the right to education for all. And now we have in the Indian Constitution, it is the fundamental right to have education under Article 2021. Free and compulsory primary education under Article 44. It is a duty of the state to provide the basic information, basic education to all people, to all children from the age of the 16 to 14. Availability of other level of education. So, if anyone want to get more education, go for the higher education. The state needs to make certain kind of the availability in the form of the creation of the institution by which through which he or she can get a higher level of the education. Participation in the cultural life, protection of the moral and material rights of creators and transmitters of cultures, right to enjoy the benefits of the scientific progress. For example, if scientific achievements and scientific progress creates certain things or important inventions have been made in the Western world, it doesn't mean that these inventions can only be benefited to the people of the West. So this and rest of the people cannot have the right to have these material and these benefits of the scientific progress. People have equal rights to have the benefits of this scientific and medical progress. Third generation of the rights are also considered as the collective rights. After first generation of the rights, which were purely based on the civil and political rights, and second generation rights, which were talked about the economic, social, and cultural rights. Similarly, the third generation rights refers to those rights which signify solidarity rights or emerging rights. These are rights were emerging themselves. Third generation right include the right to development, to a clean environment, to a humanitarian assistance. After the progress of attainment of the second generation rights, certain rights were also emerging that were included in the third generation of human rights. So engagement of war with Germany, and similarly after just the independence of India, our country had also experienced the food crisis. So it was America and other countries who sent so many food items to our countries by which we can survive, by which we can have right to food. So what do you we understand by this collective and solidarity? Collective and solidarity are the hallmark of the third generation right. Collective means to done or to shared by all members. As I already mentioned, as I already emphasized in the context of the second generation of the right, that what was the major reason behind the creation of the second generation of the right was the massive level of the inequalities in our society. So it was the consciousness that human rights are enjoyed only by the certain kind of the people, and rest of the people are still marginalized and deprived from the enjoyment of these human rights. So in the context of these rights, the collective and solidarity are required for the equal treatment, for the equal enjoyment of these fundamental and human rights. The collective means to done or shared by all members. If I enjoy fundamental rights or the human right, and my and other people are not enjoying the same right which I enjoy, it means they are they are subject of human rights violations. So we need to cover about it. We need to share. We need to make concern about it. So we should have the collective and feeling of solidarity. We should have collective efforts, and we should have feeling of solidarity. So by which, if we have the feeling, the collective efforts and feeling of solidarity, we can make efforts for the people who do not have equal rights, who are still deprived and marginalized from being enjoyed these rights. Principles of third generation of rights reflect a certain conception of the community life can only be implemented by the combined efforts of everyone, individual, state, as well as the public and private institutions. Addressing extreme poverty, because people are deprived to enjoy from various kind of the rights just because of having poverty. People do not have money. People do not have work. People do not have money to buy clothes, to buy food items, so they are deprived from the human rights. So these kind of the conditions are required to ameliorate for enabling people to enjoy the human rights. Okay, so addressing extreme poverty, the condition of the war, war time में किस तरीके से human rights का violation होता है. Ecological condition, environmental degradation has become a major concern for the violation of the human rights. Natural disaster, natural calamities are responsible for the violating of the human rights, for the impacting of the human rights. So technological changes and increasing globalization as a result of the new threats are emerging. Recognition of the new category of the human right necessary to ensure the appropriate condition for societies, particularly in the developing countries, to be able to provide the first and the second generation of the rights. So now we are talking about the fourth generation of the rights, but still there are many people, a number of the people, many states where people are not even enjoying their first generation and second generation of the rights. So so it is the solidarity and the collective actions of you who can bring change, which can bring change. So deeper understanding of the obstacles, okay, what kind of the factors that stops, that create obstacles in the way of the people for the enjoyment of the human rights. So that may stand in the way of the realizing the first and second generation of right. So these obstacles need to be withdrawn, need to be clean. There is need of making a easy conditions for the and easy accessibility for the people to enjoy equal human rights. For example, examples of the third generation of the human right, for right to having a development. आप देखा होगा कि हमारी सोसाइटी में बहुत सारे लोग जो हैं वो बहुत अच्छी जिंदगी, बहुत अच्छा लाइफ स्टैंडर्ड अपना मेंटेन करते हैं. बहुत से लोगों का लिविंग स्टैंडर्ड बढ़ रहा है, लेकिन कुछ लोग अभी भी ऐसे हैं जिनके पास घर तक नहीं है, खाने के लिए खाने के लिए खाना नहीं. सो एवरीवन हैज राइट टू डेवलपमेंट. अगर सब हमारी सोसाइटी में बहुत थोड़े से लोगों का डेवलपमेंट हो रहा है, रेस्ट ऑफ द पीपल आर स्टिल डिप्राइव्ड, इट मींस दैट this is not a justifiable development, this is not a justifiable extension of the rights. So right to self determination, right to peace. Obviously, if I am not declaring any violence, any war, any armed conflict, it means I am subject to the consequences of this conflict. I have right to peace. I being an individual, being a human, it would be my decision what kind of situation I want. whether I want a situation of conflict or whether I want a situation of peace. So it is the right to me, right to it is a right to having a peace for me, right to have healthy environment. Obviously जिस तरीके से environmental degradation हो रहा है, जिस तरीके से टेम्परेचर बढ़ रहा है, जिस तरीके से नॉइज पॉल्यूशन हो रहा है, जिस तरीके से एयर पॉल्यूशन बढ़ रहा है, जिस तरीके से वाटर पॉल्यूशन हो रहा है, इससे क्या हो रहा है that we people are deprived from all the necessary conditions for the enjoyment of the human right to share in the exploitation of the common heritage of the mankind, right to communication and humanitarian assistance. So, what are the sources of the third generation of the human right? The African Charter of the Human and People's Right. And I hope you remember that African Charter of Human Rights talks about the rest of entirely rest upon the abolition of the policy of apartheid that differentiate between the blacks and white people. Secondly, the UDHR is itself a very important document for this third generation of right. UN General Assembly Declaration on Human Right to Development, a 1992 Rio Declaration on Environment Development. In 1992, many states and people were concerned, were showing their concern that our environment is going to bad, is going to degrade day by day, year by year. Our frozen zone, our frozen zone have been subject to melt. If these frozen zone melt, it means there would be a disaster for the entire world. Therefore, in keeping mind all of these major threats in future generation, they created such kind of the declaration that there is a right to have a clear and favorable environment. The 1994 draft declaration for the indigenous people also important in the keeping mind in the consideration of the third dimension of the rights. Another picture on your screen, that Cansero Vaiva, a Nigerian writer, television producer, human rights activist, environmental activist, hero and the martyr. He also gave classification of the generation of right in 1990s, and he is known for the movement of the survival of Ogoni people in the Nigeria. There was a class conflict, there was a tribal conflict in the African continent, particularly in many states like Nigeria. So he fought for the rights of the Ogoni people, and on the basis of their engagement, on the basis of their efforts for the Ogoni people, for the welfare of the Ogoni people, the state of Nigeria, the ruler of the Nigeria, arbitrarily arrested him many times, and finally he lost his life in the struggle in the struggle for the rights of the Ogoni people. So Cansaro Vaiva created this classification of the right, that freedom of expression. The first generation of the right should have the freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of participation. Second generation of right to health, right standard of living, right to education. Third generation of the right to development, right to clean environment, right to peace. Now come to the fourth generation of the rights. Fourth generation of the right are of recent development. It is subject to different interpretation. Still, it is not decided what are the particular rights that can be incorporated in the category of the fourth generation of the rights. Right? In this context, different people interpret differently. In the context, so in different interpretation, one of the interpretation made by Laverick, he states that the rights of the fourth generation embody the so-called somatic. So Greek soma का मतलब होता है body, and these are the somatic right, yani related, those rights related to the body, biological human rights, including the right to die. If people are struggling by having a very dangerous disease, for example कुछ लोग कैंसर से इतने परेशान आ जाते हैं जिनके बहुत पेन होता है, so now states are allowing them that you should have right to die in order to, because the pain they face is quite unbearable. So on the basis of their misery, on the basis of their miserable condition, on the basis of their unbearable situation, states are allowed them to commit suicide, to letting the authority to making some such arrangement by which they can have right to die. The human being right to dispose of organs to and tissues. For example, now we are having the facility that we can have the organs of other. We can have kidney. We can have the eyes of others. We can have the eyesight by having the transplantation of the eyes of others or many other organs to of others. We can have the exchange. We can have the replacement and transplantation of the organs. Reproductive rights of the human being: right to have artificial inseminations, right to have abortions, right to sterilization, right to contraceptions, right to change sex. Now we have the many categories in the gender. We are not having the only male and female. We have also a third gender and many more. So according to another interpretation made by the VA Witte, the factors, he said that the factors, particularly information and technology, that led to the enlargement of the human rights for the fourth generation. The fourth generation of the right is the new paradigm of the freedom of information, the development and diffusion of information technology, the emergence of the global information on space, the transition to a new form of the social and economic order, changes in political process, states with information society, the necessity to ensure the autonomy of actions and the choice of legitimate behavior of a person on the basis of the equality of access to information and the protection from the dissemination of the personal information about you and about any person XYZ. These kind of the emerging situations and the concern about the violations and the protection of the rights can be a part, can be important event that can lead towards the creation of the fourth generation of the right. And obviously, uh, we are living in the 21st century, and the life in the present generation is very much different from the earlier ones. We are living in a world where more and more of our day-to-day lives relies on the technologies and access to the internet. Internet has now become the basic needs. People are demanding that right to have a internet should be declared as a fundamental right, because it has become essential part of our life. We cannot survive without the having the internet, because internet is indirectly connected to having a various kind of the information which are very supporting in discharging your day-to-day activities, whether education or work. So in keeping mount the essentiality of the technologies and the means of communications, these kind of the conditions are very much important for the interpreting the fourth generation of the rights. So should our notion of the human rights evolve to catch up? Is access to technology something that every human should be guaranteed? You know what? You are obviously, if you are attending this lecture, it means that you are having a mobile phone, you are having an internet connection. It means you are very lucky. And if you are considering that if I have a mobile phone, if I having a internet facility, everybody would have the same facility. No, many human rights scholars seem to think that so seem to think that with one of the most common notion of a fourth generation human right being that of access to the internet. You know what? Still 58% of our world do not have the right to have do not have the internet facility. They are still deprived of the various essential information which we are easily have, which we are easily enjoyed. So with more and more jobs tasks requiring some elements of technology, the lack of access to it and can leave an individual at a serious disadvantage in their work and education. People who are having a chance to get the education are deprived because they don't have devices of education. They cannot join their join the lectures of their given by their teachers, so they are deprived from the education. Such as the condition we have experienced in the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the context of this emerging situation, we already see this is in New Zealand, where recent changes to the curriculum have required students to often bring their own devices to class. So If students are unable to having or purchase such kind of a device that are essential to having a educate, to having a lectures, to having a information, to having a education, it means that this right are subjective in nature. If I am wealthy, if I am having a money, I can only buy these devices, and those who are not having a money, those who are not having the privilege to have these devices, this means they are subject to have a compromising stage. They cannot enjoy these rights, particularly the right to education, or third generation or second generation rights are depend upon the condition of the second, fourth generation of the right. So many families are still struggling to keep up with the added expenses that come along with this, and but the trade off is difficulty. If they cannot afford these devices, many poor families are not able to afford these devices. It means that their children do not have right to have education. It means if people are not having the internet facility, they do not have the right to education. No. So therefore, the feeling of solidarity and the collective efforts are required that can make you able to think for them who are deprived of these rights, that can force to you to make equal concern for the rights of their people. So what we are emphasizing here, that these four generation rights are still emerging, because we have certain conditions that change the scenario of the enjoyments of the first and second and third generation of the enjoyment. For example, right to die, right to having internet, and even the even previous generation of rights has become difficult in the context of the emerging condition and required condition for having education. So, for example, imagine a world where if you had enough money, you could buy for your child to have an increased intelligence. Even the intelligence can buy, strength can buy, and good looks all before they were born. An important thinker, Michael Sandel, a communitarian, a very good communitarian. This is one of my favorite thinker, philosopher, who who wrote a book that on the tyranny of the meritocracy. I advise to all our participants, if you would have time, please read this book. You would find that how meritorious people are destined to have to have certain kind of rights. So, should all people be afforded the access to these same opportunities? After all, Article 1 of the UDHR is that all human are free and equal. If people are free and equal, that means there should be no inequality. There should be no prevention on the enjoyment of the human rights. So, if same rapid advancement in the biotechnology and the communication technology, it means that this basic right is left nullified. These basic rights and human rights can become a subjective in nature. You know what? That two-thirds of the world's of school age children have no internet access at home. You can see the picture on your screen. This is the report. This is the fact. This is the research report under the new UNICEF reports. This is the finding that two-thirds of the world's school-age children have no internet facility at home. And COVID-19 made them further marginalized, further ghettoized in the context of the education. So now we have reached on the conclusion. So what we have learned in this module 5, sorry, which is based on the generation of the human rights, that international human rights are often considered as the corresponding to three generations. And in first generation rights refers to the civil political rights, especially those enshrined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, such as freedom of expression and the importance of the right to vote, importance of the women. When the right to the civil and political rights were created in the 18th century, and women could have get this right in the in the late 20th century. सबसे पहले 1993 में न्यूजीलैंड ने दी, उसके बाद से फिर ब्रिटेन में 1928 में मिली. And the second generation rights concern about the economic and social and cultural rights, such as the right to housing and to form a trade union. Third generation right typically is said to include the right to development, right to self-determination, minority rights, right to a healthy environment, the right to peace, and the right to ownership of the common heritage of the mankind. However, the fourth generation of rights are still emerging, as I already mentioned. As I already made argument in the context of the fourth generation of the right, and we are still trying to widen our sphere of human rights, because human rights are not exact conditions. With the development of the human condition, with the changing scenarios, with the changing conditions, the area and the sphere, the condition of the human rights can also be varied, can also be changed, can also be widened. So right of human in the age of technology may characterize as the fourth generation of the right. Thank you very much, dear participant, for patiently listen the entire lecture. And we have now completed our module fifth. With the completion of the module fifth, we have also covered the entire syllabus of our value-added course, which is which is based on which is entitled on the human rights, a general perspective. I am very happy to contribute in this value-added course, and thank you very much, Professor Zeva Akil ma'am, to providing a greater opportunities for us to contribute in this value-added course with our lectures, and for giving us the opportunity to interact with the other student of the other department and faculties. Thank you very much. God bless you all. Thank you. Tomorrow we will have another announcement. Tomorrow we will have a valedictory sessions from the 10 a.m. onwards. I request kindly present all the participants at the valedictory sessions, which will take place tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you.